For a few years now, the Ford Puma has been the manufacturer's best-selling vehicle, and around Europe and in the UK, it's a very popular choice among consumers. And today we're looking at the fully electric model, the Gen-E, which I would actually go as far as saying that is Ford's best EV, which I'll explain why throughout this video. Now, at the time of filming and in the UK, it's available in 3 different trims: the Select, the Premium, and also the Sound Edition. Prices range from roughly £30,000 and go up to roughly £35,000 without adding any additional options. Although with the UK government grant, you can actually find it right now for roughly £26,000 to £30,500, making it a pretty tempting proposition. Now, no matter which trim level you go for, the vehicle comes with a 3-year warranty or 60,000 miles. Then the battery has got 8 years or 100,000 miles, and you've also got a 12-year corrosion warranty. You then also have got a 5-year service plan, which also gives you roadside assistance. Now, in this video, which will be covered in such a format, we'll see if it's actually worth its price tag and of course how it compares to some of its key competitors. And before proceeding, I would just like to mention that if you do want to find some of the best deals for the Ford Puma Gen-E, do check out the links down in the description below or the pinned comments, or by scanning the QR code that can be found on your screen. So let's kick things off and talk about its electric range. And here across the entire trim range, at least at the time of filming and in the UK, you've got a 53 kilowatt hour battery pack. In fact, you've got 43 kilowatt hour, which is actually usable. There's also no heat pump that comes included as standard or available as an option, at least as far as I'm aware. And that means that on those colder climate days, the Puma Gen-E is just not going to be as efficient as some of its competitors. Now, nonetheless, the WLTP range claim sits between 220 to 230 miles. And from my own tested figures, which were done on the country roads, on the motorway, and within the city, I actually achieved a pretty respectable 180 to 200 miles. Now, as you'll be able to see from the mileage leaderboard, that actually does compete with some of its nearest competitors and does go toe-to-toe with some of the more expensive alternatives as well. Indeed, over here, Ford have actually done a tremendous job in this sort of small, compact SUV form factor, and therefore means that for the vast majority of consumers, the Puma Gen-E should certainly suffice. Now, in order to be as efficient as possible, you might want to enable regenerative braking, and this can be quite handy, especially when you're pottering in and around town. Now, here I'm in the 1-pedal drive mode that can be turned on by the infotainment system. And yes, there is a shortcut, a physical button that can be found towards the top of the center console, and that will bring your drive mode selectors, and at the bottom you've got the 1-pedal drive mode. Now, I'm driving at roughly 30 miles an hour, and if I were to lift off the accelerator pedal, the vehicle will actually decelerate pretty harshly and also come to a complete standstill. And I actually really do love that, because it just means that when you're driving in and around town, you can simply drive with a singular pedal. Now, if you do not want that, you can of course disable it. And here right now, I'm now on the drive mode, and this will effectively be like coasting on a regular combustion engine vehicle. So if I were to lift off at 40 miles an hour, the vehicle continues rolling. Now, if you don't want to fuff around with the infotainment system and just want to be going on the coasting mode and also regen braking whenever you want, then you have got a physical button that's found on the gear selector, and this is L mode. And right now, again, if I were to just speed up to roughly 40 miles an hour, then lift off, the vehicle will start decelerating pretty harshly, similar to what you'd find on the 1-pedal drive mode. However, it will not come to a complete standstill and will continue creeping. So it just depends as to how you actually prefer to drive. And of course, if you don't mind going on the infotainment system in order enabling and disabling that 1-pedal drive mode. Now, one thing I would like to point out, specifically in comparison to its competitors, is the fact that the biting point between the mechanical brake and also the regenerative braking from the motor is just a little bit sensitive. You kind of have to feather the accelerator pedal to a certain degree. Once you get your head around it, it becomes actually relatively second nature, but it does feel that if you've got a heavy foot, well, it'll actually be quite hard to get the right sort of biting point in order for you to actually enable regenerative braking. Just something I thought I should highlight, given I've tested a lot of other electric vehicles, and in comparison to the vast majority of its competitors, this one just feels a little bit more sensitive. Now, it goes without saying that you can plug in the vehicle, and here via CCS port you can achieve up to 100 kilowatts of input, allowing you to go from 10 to 80% in 24 minutes. Should you find a 50 kilowatt charger instead, this will take you 43 minutes. In terms of its onboard charger, it's rated at 11 kilowatts, allowing you to access 3-phase power supply. Therefore, meaning that if you do find an appropriate charge point, for example, at home or indeed out and about, then you can go from 0 to 100% in 4 hours and 45 minutes. A regular 7 kilowatt wall box will take you 7 hours instead, while a 3-pin input will take you 22.5 hours. Now, another very important factor is your overall driving comfort. And here there's a little bit of a harsh rebound that can be felt when going over uneven terrain, for example, broken country roads, or for example, when going over really steep speed bumps. However, in the grand scheme of things, it still does do a pretty good job, while soaking up anomalies and speed bumps and potholes when I was in and around town, and also giving me a pretty smooth experience when I was on the motorway. Furthermore, cabin noise is actually pretty well insulated, therefore giving you a pretty good serene experience. Now, it is worth pointing out over here that when it came to going around winding country routes, there is a little bit of body lean, however it's not too severe. And given its overall form factor, and indeed class, it was actually pretty fun to drive. However, it's worth mentioning over here that in terms of the overall traction, here it did actually suffer a little bit. When it came to putting my foot down to the metal on the accelerator pedal and, for example, cornering, it was sometimes slipping. This is indeed a little bit of torque steer and also front wheel spin that was occurring, although it wasn't too severe, and I also won't suspect a lot of consumers to be driving this vehicle in certain ways. But of course, I just thought to put it through its paces. Now, this does actually bring me on to performance. And here you have got 123 kilowatts of power, or 165 horsepower, and 290 newton meters of torque, which is dispatched to the front wheels only. I actually had it tested using RaceLogic's Performance Box Touch from 0 to 20 miles an hour in 1.89 seconds, 0 to 30 miles an hour in 2.81 seconds, 0 to 60 miles an hour in 7.55 seconds, which is slightly faster than the manufacturer's claim, 50 to 70 miles an hour in 5.25 seconds, and also recorded a peak acceleration of 0.53 G. It also has got a top speed of 99 miles an hour. Aside from putting my foot down on the accelerator pedal, I was actually pleasantly surprised by the overall braking performance as well. Indeed, over here, in a safe way on a country road, I actually planted my foot down on the brake pedal, kind of in like an emergency situation, and it actually brought the vehicle to a standstill relatively quickly. Of course, over here it's not going to compete with the non-electric model, which doesn't have to shift as much weight, but in the all-electric market, it's actually pretty good, and therefore does instill good level of confidence if you ever do have to use the brake in such a way. So next up, we get onto its interior design, and in comparison to some of its key competitors, it doesn't quite compete, because here Ford has cheaped out in terms of the use of materials. Here, towards the dashboard, the door trims and the center console, you'll find a lot of harsh plastic, which is never a great thing to find. In terms of the upholstery and stitching work, however, I've got no complaints. Of course, it depends in terms of what trim level you go for, and in terms of the pictured Select with its all-fabric design, it actually does look the part. It's also aided by the fact you've got this kind of two-tone finish around the cabin. In terms of practicality, you've got physical buttons and dials that are found on the steering wheel with traditional stalks. You've also got a few physical buttons that are found at the top of the center console, for example for media controls or indeed shortcuts, for example to your drive modes. However, all the other controls, including your climate, will have to be done via the 12-inch display that's planted at the center of the dashboard. Now, the display itself is very vivid and also intuitively laid out. However, here, when it comes to accessing different menus or going between different apps, it is actually pretty laggy, and therefore it does feel a little bit cumbersome, especially if you can compare and contrast it with some of its rivals, which offer you a great use of technology within the cabin, and therefore making it feel a little bit more fluid. Alas, that's not the case in the Ford. What I do like, however, is the fact that you have got a small little menu on the left-hand side, at least for those of us who drive a right-hand drive vehicle, which gives you quick access to certain settings, for example, your navigation, or for example, the audio. Furthermore, it's great to see that Amazon Alexa is built in, which can be used if, of course, you want to use it. And you've also got Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, which are supported over a wired and wireless format. Furthermore, turn-based navigation data from these third-party mobile operating systems are fed through to the fully digitalized 12.8-inch instrument cluster. Indeed, it's actually pretty large, but provides you all the key information that you require. For example, your traversing speed, the amount of range that's remaining, and the safety systems that are in operation. Now, it would have been further appreciated if the manufacturer had also included a head-up display, because it would have added to the overall safety credentials by keeping your eyes planted on the road. I can't complain too much given its overall asking price, but some of its competitors do indeed offer said feature. Now, in terms of its audio system, as standard you've got a 6-speaker setup, which actually does do pretty well across the sound frequency range. If, however, you want an even punchier and a more fulfilling experience, then you might want to go for the premium or the sound edition models, which add a 10-speaker Bang & Olufsen system instead. Indeed, you'll have additional audio drivers within the cabin and a subwoofer within the boot. In fact, if you want a detailed breakdown of the audio system, make sure you check out my dedicated audio review that can be found up on your pop-up banner or by following the links down in the description below or the pinned comments. Moving on, we get onto storage, and here you've got the glove box, which has actually been optimized for right-hand drive vehicles, although it does feel a little bit small given the fact it's got a relatively large lip. Nonetheless, you have got plenty of storage within the cabin. First off, at the front of the center console, you have got a non-slip material, and here there's also an area for you to place a smartphone, which can also simultaneously wirelessly charge. This is actually included as standard across the entire trim range. Further down, you've also got two cup holders, and then you've got an area that's found underneath the center armrest. Here you'll also find a small little tray, which can be handy for placing your keys, your loose change, or indeed your wireless key fob. Underneath the center console, you've got an even larger area with a non-slip material yet again, which can be handy for placing your slightly larger valuables. Here you'll also find a USB Type A and Type C ports, which can be used for providing charge and also connecting up to the infotainment system. You'll find a further two USB Type-C ports and also a 12-volt socket at the back of the center console, which are used for providing charge to your rear occupants. In terms of the overall door bins, the front two are large enough to accommodate a 500ml bottle alongside some small to medium-sized valuables, and it's unsurprising to learn that the rear two are a little bit more limited. It is a shame, however, that none of the door bins are lined in any sort of fabric or non-slip material, and there's also no pull-down armrest compartments for your rear occupants. Now, of course, when it comes to storage, we have to talk about its boot, and here you've got a humongous 574 litres to play around with, or 1,283 litres if you drop down the seats. Very comparable with even larger size SUVs out there on the market, and indeed it's actually pretty impressive. In terms of practicality, you've got a hatchback design with a manually operated boot in the Select trim, although within the Comfort pack, which can be added for an additional £950, you can have an electric tailgate, which by the way comes fitted as standard in the other trim levels. Elsewhere, you have got 60/40 rear split folding seats and a flat loading bay. That is, of course, if you have the boot floor in terms of its highest position, because if you were to drop it down, then you'll have even larger space, although there's a step between the rear portion of the seats and, of course, the boot floor itself. Now, this does actually bring me on to the underfloor compartment, which is absolutely humongous, among one of the largest ones I've ever seen on any sort of electric vehicle, competing with, for example, the Tesla Model Y, which also similarly does offer a huge space in this department. Now, this actually does also serve as a secondary purpose within the Ford Puma range, and here this is also called the Gigabox, effectively allowing you to place, let's say, ice and drinks in the back in terms of the underfloor compartment, and also the quick ability to drain it by opening up the drain cover. So yes, this is actually pretty practical if you're going to be taking the vehicle with you on camping, or for example, if you just want to have a sort of party trick with your friends. Really nice thinking by the manufacturer. Furthermore, it's also good to see that unlike some of its rivals, you've actually got a frunk as well. In other words, an area that's found at the front of the vehicle underneath the bonnet. There's a 43-litre compartment to be more specific, and while it is actually handy for placing your charging cable, it is worth mentioning that it's not as practical to use because the bonnet itself is manually operated and also does not have any sort of hydraulics, so therefore can be a little bit heavy if you're going to be using it on a frequent basis. Now elsewhere, I would also like to mention that you've got a max towing weight of 750 kilograms. Not exactly the best sort of figure, both for braked and unbraked trailers, but indeed the fact it does actually support towing is appreciated in comparison to some of its rivals, which do not accept it whatsoever. This actually brings me on to seating comfort, and all the seats themselves are very accommodating and soft and had no issues whatsoever. Although it's disappointing that across the entire trim range, you've got four-way manually operated front seats only. And indeed, there's no electronic controls or, for example, a memory function like you'd find on some of its rivals. Furthermore, you've got heated wheel and a heated front seats only available as standard in the Sound Edition. If you want this in the other trims, you'll have to splash out on the Winter Pack for an additional £350. Speaking of your options, you've got an openable panoramic roof for £1,100 in the Select and Premium trims only. Indeed, it's omitted altogether in the top spec Sound Edition because of the two-tone design, so definitely some food for thought. In terms of overall headroom and legroom, I had no problems whatsoever at the front. And at the rear, headroom was actually surprisingly optimized, and that's just due to the fact that the seats themselves felt actually pretty low down. And as someone who's just under 6 foot, it was actually pretty good. Same could be said even while sat in the rear middle seat, just due to the fact that the manufacturer has optimized the rear footwell design. However, in terms of legroom, it is a little bit limited, and it's also a little bit uncomfortable due to the overall design of those seats, and therefore means that it can cause a little bit of strain on your quad muscles. Moving swiftly on, we get onto the exterior design, and I'll be curious to know what you make of it down in the comments section below. Subjectively, I really do love what the manufacturer's achieved with the fully electric model. At the front, you've got this sort of cute sort of design, which is aided by the fact that you've got these large headlights. Then you've got a front grille, which has actually been covered, and I actually prefer it in comparison to the regular grille that you find on the petrol models. Towards the side, you've got a really nice silhouette, and that's aided by the fact that you've got really nice looking 17 to 18 inch alloys that come fitted as standard across the entire trim range, although you can go for optional 17 to 19 inch alloys as well. As for the rear, it very much fits with Ford's DNA and does actually give you that sort of modern twist to it. Frankly, when it comes to its exterior design, I've got no complaints. As for your colour finishes, it comes as standard in a solid white in the Select and Premium trims, although it moves over to a metallic white finish in the Sound Edition model. You have got other metallic colours to choose from yellow, black, silver, red or blue for an additional £800. Speaking about its exterior design, it brings me on to safety, and here it was actually recently retested by Euro NCAP due to the addition of the fully electric model. It was awarded 4 out of 5 stars, scoring 75% in adult occupancy, 84% in child occupancy, and 69% in its safety assist scores. In terms of the driver assistance systems, as standard, you've got pre-collision assist with autonomous emergency braking, cruise control with intelligent speed limiter, which is rather basic, and also lane keeping aid with lane departure warning. And if you do want to up the ante, you might want to go for the Advanced Driver Assistance Pack, which costs an additional £950, or comes as standard in the top spec Sound Edition model. This gives you collision mitigation system, intelligent speed assistant with adaptive speed control, in other words, adaptive cruise control, lane change assist with lane centering aid, which gives you steering support, blind spot information, and also advanced speed sign recognition. Now, while all these systems are very much appreciated, it is worth mentioning that they come re-enabled every single time you step inside the vehicle. And in order for you to disable them, you'll have to faff around with the infotainment system, which is actually quite cumbersome. Although it's good to see that by double pressing the button that can be found on the steering wheel, you can quickly negate the lane departure warning, handy for example when you're on the country roads. However, it would have been good to have another shortcut, for example, for the speed limit warning, which sometimes was a little bit off in terms of recognizing the actual speed limit of the road. Now, complaints aside, I would like to point out that within the Advanced Driver Assistance Pack, you do also have 360-degree cameras, front parking aid, and reverse brake assist. Although it's worth pointing out over here that a rear view camera and sensors do come included as standard across the entire trim range. Now, in terms of its turning circle, it's rated at 10.5 meters, therefore making maneuverability a breeze. I had no problems whatsoever in tight parking spaces. Furthermore, visibility at the back is pretty good because of a wide opening and also the inclusion of a rear view wiper, which is not always the case in modern vehicles. Then you've got nice wide openings towards the side, allowing you to physically check for your blind spot, and then towards the front it's very easy to peer over the bonnet. However, the positioning of the rear view mirror is not favourable, at least not for me. In terms of my own driving position and height, I just felt that it's a little bit further down the windscreen than it should be. A complaint that I've had of some of its rivals, and it's a shame to see it present also on the Puma Gen-E. So with all that in mind, it brings us on to our verdict of the Ford Puma Gen-E. And sure enough, it's not exactly perfect across the board. See, I would have liked the manufacturer to include a heat pump as standard across the entire trim range, which would have added to the overall efficiency on those colder climate days. Better the overall driving comfort by adding a more advanced suspension configuration. Added more standard features within the cabin, for example with the driver assistance systems, or even when it comes to the overall seating comfort with heated seats or a heated steering wheel, and also optimize the technology by providing you a little bit more of a snappy experience. But nonetheless, given its overall price tag and in terms of the overall electric range that you're getting, I do still think that the Ford Puma Gen-E is a fantastic alternative to what else you can find out there on the market, and indeed goes toe-to-toe with some of its key competitors. And as a result of this, I can definitely see myself recommending it, and as such, it gets our Best Buy award. Now, I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below, and of course, if you would pick it over some of its rivals. And if you've enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing, and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Chris from TotallyEV, and I hopefully see you next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.